Hello, and welcome back to Lauren's Legends. Today, we will brave the frigid cold of the Andes mountain range, venture into the peaks, and find the tale of the Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. This is a harrowing tale of survival by any means necessary, and I do mean any means necessary. It's a good time to say that while this story is one of perseverance and courage, it also details true horror and tragedy. Fair warning, this one may inspire you, but may also disgust you. So buckle up, this one's gonna be a bumpy ride. Let's dive right in. Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector Laguarra was nervous and excited. Although he had already flown a number of hours, this would be his first time he would be at the controls for a flight over the Andes mountain range. The pilot, who had flown this flight many times, Julio Cesar Ferraris, decided that this would be his teaching moment. So he would let the co-pilot, Laguarra, fly the plane for his first mission over the Andes. This would turn out to be a fatal mistake. The flight had actually begun the day before with Ferraris at the helm, but worsening conditions had forced a landing along the route from Montevideo to Santiago. Their home for the night would be a place called Mendoza in Argentina. This stop would mean that their fateful flight would resume its course on the next day, on Friday the 13th of 1972. Yes, Friday the 13th. Due to the weather and cloud cover, the pilots had been using only their instruments to keep track of their position and course. Such conditions are called Instrument Meteorological Conditions, or IMC. Without visual references, Laguarra determined from the readouts after about an hour that the plane had made it past Curico. This city is a spot on the map where the plane was supposed to head north along the proper path all the way to its destination. So he turned the plane to the north, presumably still believing everything was under control. You see, instead of going straight across, it would go down in a sort of U shape, so that way it would cross over at a lower elevation of the mountains. But he wasn't where he thought he was. They radioed to the air traffic controller in Curico that they would be there momentarily, and the response from the ground was all clear. But remember, they were not using radar. So the air traffic controller had no idea that the plane was still roughly 40 miles out. However, neither the pilot nor the co-pilot, Laguarra, who had the controls, noticed the blinking light telling them how far away they were. This blinking light had no sound on it, so no one was alerted to it at all. That's when the first air pocket of turbulence would shake the plane. The Uruguayan rugby team in the back cheered along with some of their family who were making the trip to watch the match. The atmosphere was certainly one of partying and amusement. That all changed after the second air pocket rocked the team, and the plane plummeted hundreds of feet through the air. They would break below the cloud cover and immediately knew that something was terribly wrong. They were supposed to be flying over the Andes, of course, but why were the peaks so close? Back in the cockpit, the pilots were panicking. Yes, an obvious navigational error was made, but just then wasn't the time for placing blame. They grabbed the controls and yanked as hard as they could, the looming peak dead ahead reflecting in the whites of their eyes. The plane arched upwards, nearly vertical, but it wasn't enough. The tail cone clipped the side of the mountain. Then they collided again, with the right wing was torn clean off, the propeller cutting a swath through the fuselage. The entire tail section came free, taking 3 passengers, the navigator and the flight attendant with it. Momentum shot them up the side of the next rise until they smashed an outcropping that took off the left wing. The other propeller tore through the fuselage as well, creating more holes in the plane, dropping 2 more passengers from their seats. the main body of the plane careened down the mountainside going 220 some miles per hour before crashing smack into a snowbank, coming to a final rest. Some may think to take a deep breath here, a sign of relief, but the nightmare had only just begun. Have you ever seen the very first episode of Lost, right at the beginning of the show when the plane first crashes on the beach? Well, I imagine that's what this initial scene was like. After the fuselage of Flight 571 came to a stop in a whiteout. Obviously, the snowy atmosphere and the frigid temperatures on top of a mountain will change things, but it always seemed like it would be a similar scene of carnage. The carnage, the absolutely devastating injuries, and the bodies of loved ones all wrapped in the suddenness of the horrific event, including the 5 who were ripped from the plane during the crash, and the 7 who would perish upon impact. A total of 12 passengers didn't survive the initial disaster. The pilot, Parrado, would be jammed into the panels of the crushed cockpit, deceased. Amazingly, the co-pilot, LaGuerra, would still be breathing, but he likewise was smashed into the instruments and knew there would be no escape from his plight. He would later ask those able to bring him his pew-pew so he could simply end the suffering, but they refused. The young men simply could not bring themselves to let him do that. The authorities would later decide that it was actually LaGuerra's error that would lead to the crash, but he would pass that first night. He believed that they were much closer to the airport than they were. It is worth noting that no one that went through this ordeal blames his memory or resents the tragic errors made, at least not publicly. Amidst the broken legs and compound fractures, and one guy with a clear fracture in his skull who wouldn't wake up, was Enrique Platero, who literally had a long piece of metal sticking out from his side. Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zabino were actually first-year medical students for what it was worth and tried to triage the wounded. These guys were still in school and they really had no idea what they were doing, but they jumped on it to help everyone. Canessa would move to help Platero, the man who had the metal in his side. Can you imagine having to rip, we see this stuff in movies and become desensitized to it, but I'm not sure I could rip out a long, jagged piece of metal out of my friend's abdomen. But good thing I'm not Canessa, because that's exactly what he did. He basically said, hey, look over there, and yanked it out. The extraction was brutal, no doubt, but Canessa would take some snow and literally pack it into the man's spilling intestines. That's right, the force of the removal brought some of Platero's tubing along for the ride. What's more amazing still is the fact that Platero would then begin to assist Canessa and Zabrino with all of the others. Guys, his guts are literally hanging from his body 1 minute before, and the man is still pulling people out of the wreckage, saving lives like an absolute hero. I mean, wow, talk about fortitude and adrenaline. But unfortunately, due to the obvious lack of immediate medical attention, those who had compound fractures would not survive. 5 more would be lost before the morning. Just think about what would have had to have been going through the minds of the survivors as the sun sank below the horizon. That first cold night, no, not cold, they're roughly 12,000 feet up. The first brutal night must have felt like it lasted forever. Remember that they were headed to a rugby match in warm weather. And these guys had never seen snow in their life before. They had no coats, no sweatshirts, or heavy climbing jackets. They literally had to clog up the open end of the fuselage with whatever debris they could find, and then huddle like cattle just to stay a bit warm, just to stave off hypothermia. They would lay there and hold each other, just shivering through the night. The despair that would have had to have come with a howling wind is just simply unthinkable. They would have already been looking for rescue to come before nightfall, but when it didn't, they had to think that they were surely doomed. I imagine that this was the first in a series of the longest nights of all of their lives. Temperatures at night up there can descend to negative 30 degrees. I can't even say that without shivering. And that's to say nothing of the conditions on a windswept rock face covered in ice and snow. So it's important in such a situation to establish a leader, someone to make the hard decisions, someone to rally behind, someone to take strength and direction from. Marcelo Perez would be the first to assume the mantle of leadership in the impromptu camp. He was, after all, the captain of the team and already admired and respected. He helped organize the projects that needed to be done, like plugging up the fuselage against the elements as best as they could, figuring out what supplies were left and still consumable, and, most importantly, many who made it through noted his optimism about rescue and being a source of motivation and hope. In an absolute nightmare scenario such as this one, being able to maintain some kind of semblance of morale, some small belief in rescue is the only thing that stops one from giving up, from simply laying down and succumbing to the situation. Marcelo wasn't the only one. Adolfo, or Fido, Schrouch would improvise a device using the metal sheets of the seat cushions to harness the power of the sun to melt snow and make drinking water. He would also MacGyver pieces of the windshield into makeshift sunglasses to help fight against snow blindness. And every time I hear snow blindness, I think of Talladega Nights and snow blindness and cats, and I don't know, it's in there. I can't get rid of it. But back to the story. I imagine that little things like sunglasses and these little successes went a long way in battling despair. Keeping busy with these tasks such as these would have helped to keep their minds off of the absolute horror that was all around them. Well, remember that guy whose skull was fractured? His name was Nando Parrado, and he would become one of the most, if not the most important figure of this entire story. Nando had been laid out among the others that had passed away because his teammates believed he was dead when he would not wake up. No one knew that he had actually slipped into a coma, and the fact that he was laid out in the snow had actually saved his life. The cold temperatures and the snow had actually kept his brain swelling down, and he would awake on the third day from what was believed to be certain death. Unfortunately for Nando, he would wake up to find out that one of the deceased was his own mother, and one of those too injured to care for was his 19-year-old sister. She would pass away in his arms after 6 more days of agony. One of the worst things about this is that he had been given 2 extra free tickets, and he had offered them to his mother and his sister. Despite this, morale did remain relatively high. There was still hope that the search and rescue teams were just down the mountain, were just about to come around the fold in the rock face. That is, until they found an old transistor radio jammed between the seats. It took an improvised antenna compliments of Roy Harley to get it working, but they would be able to hear the news of the search. Great news, you would think. But no, on the 11th day, they would hear the airwaves deliver the worst news any had yet heard in their lives. The search had been called off. What? How could they do this? How could they not keep looking for them? They had actually even seen a couple of planes fly overhead, but what became apparent from the broadcast was that there was just no way to spot the white fuselage and the perpetual white blanket covering the heights of the Andes. They were blended in. Their own existence was camouflaged. They were on their own. As we've already established, maintaining morale in a situation like this is probably the most important aspect of surviving. As the initial shock of the crash wore off and the initial first times of seeing people pass away in front of their eyes, you can imagine that opposing ideas about said survival would crop up. Some, like Nando Parrado, had argued from the beginning that their only hope to make it out was on their own. So when the news came down that the search had been called off, he was one of the only ones who didn't immediately panic, as if more panic was going to worsen the impossible situation. Likewise, amidst the weight of the silent dread descending upon those in the fuselage, came the slightly sarcastic but still optimistic Gustavo Nikolic, who would stick his head in there to tell them that there was actually good news. Good news? What in the world? He told them it was good news because it meant that they were going to get out of there themselves. Many were bolstered by his resolve and managed to not give up like their would-be rescuers. However, for Marcelo Perez, the news was just too much. Many who made it through this ordeal stated that this news seemed to break Perez's spirit and he was no longer the optimistic leader. Alright, so if you're unfamiliar with the story, you're probably doing the calculations and the math ain't mathin', especially because this was not meant to be a long flight and the cabin was not stocked with lots of supplies. In fact, the original inventory of salvageable resources was slim pickings at best. I suppose the bottles of wine might have been the smallest of comforts, but there were only 8 chocolate bars, 3 jars of jam, 1 can of mussels, 1 pack of almonds, some dates, some candy, and a couple of plums. Remember that after the first night, there were only 28 remaining survivors to split all of it. Despite their best attempts, the meager rations were gone within the first week. Also, consider how high up they were, meaning vegetation and animals were sparse at best. Add in the fact that these ridiculous conditions prevented them from venturing out too far from the fuselage. That's to say nothing of the fatigue, snow blindness, altitude sickness, and hypothermia while desperately wandering around. You can probably see where this is going to go at this point. Many could not even think, could not even imagine consuming their friends and loved ones, even in the face of such insurmountable odds. They would be rescued, and then they wouldn't have to do anything like that, and then they had heard it. The radio broadcast informing them that the search had been called off had changed all of that thought process. Those remaining would make a pact that when any more passed, which there was a lot of back and forth and uncomfortableness, and many people saying that they could never ever make that choice, but the others told them that if they did pass, they could consume their flesh to survive. It would be Canessa, who was the medical student, who would voice up and tell them that their bodies needed the protein and vitamins in order to survive because of the conditions and whatever else they faced. And it would also be him who would volunteer with the Strouch cousins to go out there in the snow for the gruesome work of carving the substance off of their comrades with a small piece of glass. They would do it out of sight of the others, so that way the others wouldn't have to see what they were consuming. I have listened to several interviews where Canessa would talk about the first time that he would go out there to carve it off, and he would take it from the buttocks first because it had the most meat, and it was so difficult for him to cut through the frozen flesh. He was a first-year medical student. He did not do this kind of stuff in his schooling, but he did it so the others would not have to. He would also be the first one to partake. He knew he had to leave by example or else the others would never do it. Those that would survive would only do so by committing this unthinkable act. They would not be here today without it. However, Canessa would later describe that the decision was one they knew they would have to take all along, but it was too terrifying to contemplate at first. He felt like he would be, in a way, stealing their souls. And you also have to think this whole team was very, very strong in their Catholic faith, and this was absolutely taboo. Nando would write on the decision in his book, Miracle in the Andes, 72 Days on the Mountain and My Long Trek Home. He would say that they would even eat the leather of the shoes, the chairs, everything they could find before they had to come to that terrible decision. Some took so much longer to accept, as it was the only way to survive, and they believed that if they did it, they would be damning their souls to eternal torment. But eventually, there was only one option. One of the staunchest holdouts was Liliana Menthal. She could only be convinced to consume the deceased by likening the act to taking that of communion or the Eucharist. Unfortunately, fate can be utterly sadistic in its supreme indifference. Not long after this decision was made, on October 29th, day 17, the mountain got angry. Of course, it waited until the unyielding cold dark of the night, around midnight, while they're all in the fuselage, cuddled up together, trying to survive another freezing night, to release an avalanche upon the helpless survivors. The snow and ice nearly swallowed the fuselage completely. A struggle to breathe would ensue as the snow packed in around them, barely leaving any room for them to find any air. 8 more doomed souls would never again emerge from the plane wreckage, including sweet Liliana, who was beloved by all. She was the last female touch that they had, and calm, sweet voice, and very encouraging. And she had cared for many of them like a mothering nurse. The absolute hero who saved lives while holding his guts in, Enrique Platero, was also among the deceased. Worst of all was the loss of the team captain Marcelo Perez, as if the mountain itself was mocking their hope and optimism. As if this wasn't enough, it would actually take the others some time to escape the buried fuselage as well. The only air remaining inside was quickly running out, and if this wasn't going to be their tomb, they would have to figure something out quick. Nando Parrado would be able to push a piece of luggage rack through the window and let in some air. This, however, did nothing to actually get those remaining out of the death trap. They would have to fight and claw and dig and will their way out through the busted cockpit window. It was morning, but it hardly even seemed so. The worst blizzard they had yet faced roared in their face and chased them right back into their only refuge from the whiteout. 3 days would go by. That's right, 3 days the storm took to blow itself out. 3 days they were stuck literally laying on top of their deceased friends. 3 days without their usual subsistence, which was laying outside to be dried out in the sun, but was now laying under buried feet of snow. Keep in mind, when Canessa and the others would gather the meat, they would lay it out on metal sheets so it would cook, so it wouldn't feel like raw meat that they were eating. This unrelenting hunger that they were now obviously having was driving the people beyond the limits that they thought they were capable of to survive. Nando would later report that the flesh of those in the plane, unable to be dried out, would make him gag instantly. And you also had to think that the entire time up until this moment, the meat had been gathered without the rest seeing it. And now they were having to resort to this animalistic way of getting it themselves. But it had to be done. And they had to live, had to make it out whatever the cost. Even though these friends had been surviving alongside of them just days and hours before. Imagine that for a moment. You are in a confined place, death all around you, and to survive, you have to cut a chunk out of someone that you know. Whew. Eventually, the snowstorm abated, and the survivors emerged onto the side of the mountain. But of course, a new group dynamic would need to be established. Really, it was just a question of who was going to do the inevitable task of now preparing their meals. Vito MacGyver Strouch, master of the drinking water, and his cousin Eduardo, along with Daniel Fernandez, would step up to the plate. This kind of made them the de facto leaders at the time. Well, we're now 3 weeks in, and things are worse than ever. The only topic of conversation is obviously about going for rescue. Before the avalanche, the group had been divided on this due to the fact that conditions on any sort of expedition were going to be beyond devastating, and most didn't think that they could make it very far. Others were in a different mind. Their biggest issue was actually not one that they were even aware of. Remember, the co-pilot mistakenly thought that they had passed Carico. Well, he had related this belief to the survivors before he passed. So, in the mind of Roberto Canessa, if they could simply climb the rest of the ridge they had been staring at now for near a month, Chile, salvation, was on the other side. Unfortunately, he was wrong, but more on that in a bit. Of course, those able had been exploring the immediate area, but a longer trek was beginning to gain traction as the general consensus. Volunteers were needed, and Numa Turacati was desperate to go, desperate to help, but the wound in his leg sustained during the original crash had become infected, and he was deemed unable to make the journey. That left Antonio Vizintin, Canessa, and good old Nando. The three would prepare themselves over the next few days by eating a bit more, resting a bit more, and even doing a bit of training. And many of the others had noticed that every day Nando was able to, he was always walking. He was trying to stay active. Still, they decided to wait an entire week after the decision was made, hoping that the weather would be warmer. Ideally, they would climb over the mountain and descend into Chile, but this was deemed far too difficult. So our three heroes headed east and down instead. Hopefully, they would find an easier spot to turn back to the west and civilization. November 15th marked just over a month on the mountain, and Nando, Roberto, and Antonio looked down the hill ahead of them after hours of walking, even though it was only roughly a mile. But they could barely make out something ahead of them. Was that? Indeed, it was the missing plane section. The tail had slid a lot further down the mountain, but to the three men, it represented hope. It was just the kind of boost of morale to get them over the line and might keep them alive long enough to make it out. The sun was already going down, so it was party time at the tail section. They found chocolate, 3 hamburgers, rum, and some Coke to go with, cigarettes and warm clothes, comic books, and even some medicine. Talk about hitting the mother lode. The biggest score of all was the plane's batteries, which seemed intact. Just imagine what this find did for their spirits. They wouldn't immediately return to the others the next day, instead continuing on in hopes of still finding help. After nearly becoming permanent ice fixtures on the side of the mountain, that next day they decided to climb back down to the tail section. There, they would gather all they could carry, minus the batteries, which were far too heavy, to lug up the steep snowy incline and ascend back to their group. Obviously, the news that the tail section was close by was a lift for everyone, not to mention the supplies. And, hello, chocolate! The new optimism to get the radio working emerged, and Roy Harley would disconnect the radio and descend to the tail section. Several days, too many days, they would eventually have to pass on it and finally give up, as it was just a bad job, deciding that it was no longer worth the cost of trucking down there to try to get the radio working. They would find out much later that they had the wrong kind of batteries and they were never going to get it to work in the first place. It was back to plan A. They would have to go for help. That was the only answer anymore. Nando knew it was time. It was time to stop waiting for the weather to get warmer. They had to do it. It was time to summit that ridge that they had been living on. He was certain that overcoming that challenge would be the final hurdle to rescue. There was still the issue, however, of surviving the frozen conditions of the Andes nights while they were on their way. Ingenuity and desperation combined to form a plan. The insulation in the fuselage was torn from the walls and the waterproof fabric from the AC unit. With some electrical wire and a sewing kit they found in the luggage, Carlitos Paez would use his mother's own needles to sew together a sleeping bag from the gathered material. It took them some time, and he even taught the others how to sew as well to speed up the process. The sleeping bag was large enough to fit all three of the brave souls readying to make the trek, and their combined body heat should keep them warm enough to get through the frigid dark. On December 11th, they completed the sleeping bag, but Numa Turcotte would pass after 2 months on the mountain. No one blames him for his severe aversion to what they were eating, but it seemed that he ate less and less and eventually succumbed to the infection in his leg. This drove home to the 16 remaining that the time had come for them to risk it all in the hopes of finding salvation. Even still, Nando Parrado was the only one who was actually up for it, and he had to convince Canessa and Vizintin to go as well. But Nando himself had 2 things that were pushing him to go more than the others, and that was number 1, they had run out of meat, we'll just say that, and the only 2 that were left were now his mom and his sister and Numa. So he knew that there were next if he did not get them all rescued. And number 2 was the fact that he could not live with himself knowing that his father would never know that he was still alive. So he pushes these other guys to go with him because he has to get down and he's got to tell his dad that he's still alive and get his mom and sister back home so that way they can have a burial. So he gets the guys and they start out based on their belief that rescue was just over the ridge. They would only bring 3 days worth of meat, but it would take them those 3 days just to make it to the top of the ridge. And I don't know if y'all have ever hiked up a steep mountain. It is not easy. It is rough. And I can't imagine being out here for however long they have been in this frigid, cold, only surviving on meat. Think about how weak they would have been and still trekking straight up a mountainside. Canessa has later said that the first night of this journey was the worst night of his life, which is saying a lot. They couldn't find flat ground to lay on and ended up on the edge of a cliff in a blizzard. Morning 3 of the expedition found Canessa hanging back so the other 2 could see what there was to be seen at the top. They crested the ridge expecting glorious green to meet their eyes, but it was only more peaks, more snow, and more crumbling hope as far as the eye could see. They would descend back to Roberto in despair. A decision had to be made. Onward or go back. They decided that in order to stretch their rations further, they would send Antonio back down. Using a seat cushion they found nearby, Vizintin would make it back to the fuselage in under an hour, sliding down the hill like some kind of macabre roller coaster. Wow, how dispiriting is that? They climbed for 2 whole days. For 2 whole days. And they had barely gone anywhere. But Nando Parrado's will was still indomitable. He and Canessa climbed back to the ridge, and they knew they were walking to their deaths. Canessa would later express that he would rather walk towards the looming specter than wait for it to come to him. They hardened their resolve and said, "We've been through so much. Now let's go die together." From their high vantage point, they were able to see a spot on a valley that seemed to contain less snow. Right at the bottom of that first hill in front of them was a ridgeline that led generally in that direction. It was as good of a plan as any, so they set off, simply refusing to lay down and die, refusing to give up on their fellows who needed them. Nando and Canessa were the only hope left that those remaining on the mountain had, and they both knew it. You have to think that at some point this thought was the only thing that kept them going, that kept one foot going in front of the other like tunnel vision. That was what they needed because it took 7 more days to get down the mountain. 7 days. Heroes. Simple as that. It doesn't get any more inspiring than the strength it must have taken for those 2 men to soldier on after everything they had been through. Finally, they found the Rio San Jose and followed it to the next river and then to the next and in the system down to the valley they had spotted from up high. When they came to the bottom, they would set up camp for the night. Canessa had no more left to give, and their little fire crackled merrily when they heard something across the river. They looked up and must have thought they were hallucinating. 3 horsemen galloped up on the opposite bank and then were peering at them from over the water. Can you imagine the flood of dopamine and adrenaline that would have hit our 2 heroes at that point? The relief of hope restored, but they still had a job to do, and the riders on the other side of the shore couldn't hear any of Nando's shouted pleas. The men shouted tomorrow at them, unsure if they heard, but the men would return the following morning to find Nando and Canessa right where they had left them. Sergio Catalan, one of the 3 men, came up with the idea to tie some sort of paper and pencil to a rock and toss it over the river. Nando would then write down their plight and shuck it back across. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but this is roughly what he related. We came from an airplane that crashed in the mountains. We are from Uruguay. There are still injured people up there that we have to get out of there. There is no food and we are all weak. We can no longer walk. When are you going to come get us? Catalan would throw some bread across and then start the 10-hour ride back to the nearest town with a phone, which clearly showed how far out this plane crash was. So Catalan would pass by another man who was transporting goods by a mule and tell him to take the 2 survivors to the village of Las Maitanes for some much needed rest. The duo had climbed nearly 2,750 feet, then descended nearly 5,000 feet, walking over 33 miles to do so, with the literally only thing keeping them going was the thoughts of those left behind counting on them. These 2 are absolute legends in my book. Now enters the Chilean military. They would fly to Las Mentes and hear the harrowing tale before Nando was able to guide the 2 helicopters to the crash site. You can only imagine the scenes of absolute joy when those still up on the mountain heard the rotors and spotted their saviors on the horizon. Due to the harsh conditions and the weight limits on the choppers, only half of the survivors were lifted out on that first trip. Talking about heroes, 4 of the rescue workers actually stayed up on the mountain so more survivors could be taken down. And it kind of makes me wonder if those 4 guys looked around at the carnage and seriously regretted staying behind after the others left. Like, you have to think about what was still laying around that they could see. But anywho, on December 23rd, 1972, helicopters would complete the rescue of those who made it through this horrific ordeal of the Flight 571. 72 days after it crashed high in the Andes Mountains. Of course, this would be international news. Everyone who had heard about the story believed that there was no way anyone could have made it there for so long. And why did they not look emaciated? Reporters and journalists flocked to hear Nando's and the other stories. It had obviously been too long for them to have survived eating what was on the plane or had been brought with them, but in the first interview, Nando and Canessa did not reveal their cannibalism. Naturally, they were worried about the reception such an act would receive amongst those who couldn't possibly imagine the choices that had to have been made up there. Eventually, however, the truth did come out, and it was met with mixed reactions. Many were horrified, and rightly so, but as more and more details emerged, it was obvious that there simply was no other choice. The legacy of this event has come down to us through the years from the various documentaries, books, and 3 full-length movies. Survive was a Mexican film based on a book written almost immediately back in 1976. Alive, which is the movie I grew up on, also based on a book, was released in the 90s, and The Society of the Snow has come out more recently in 2023. 5 of these survivors have actually penned books themselves detailing the horrific tragedy, including Nando Parrado. Interest in this story has also led some to make expeditions to the site, where there is now a monument and a common grave for those unable to make it off the mountain. The memory of this fateful plane crash sticks in the mind to this day. I will say that the ones that did survive decided to make the absolute most out of their newfound chance in life. Of the 16 that survived, 14 are still alive today. They reunite each year on December 22nd, the anniversary of being rescued, and celebrate life and give gratitude and remembrance to those that passed. They bring their children and grandchildren to remind them that what they had to do on the mountain was worth it, and that they all strive to still do their best because they somehow got handed the lucky cards. You may question how they could be lucky, but they face things that we cannot even imagine. But through the crash, they sat in the right place. Through the avalanche, they were in the right place. They also made the decision to eat. To them, it was all worth it. Roberto Canessa would become a renowned pediatric cardiologist and still saves lives to this day. Nando Parrado became a motivational speaker and a famous race car driver, still living on that adrenaline. Carlitos Paez travels all over the world as a motivational speaker, and he is the CEO of his own company that he created. Eduardo Strauch became an architect and is the owner of one of the most successful architecture firms in Uruguay. The other survivors have done amazing things as well with their lives, but choose to live a more quiet life, not wanting the infamy to reflect on their own loved ones. This is a story that truly astonishes me. I have to find gratitude that I have never had to go through something like this. I'm not sure that I could. The resolve and the fortitude that they had to come up with to simply survive. I mean, 72 days in this frigid hell would be an absolute eternity. Those last few days sitting in that fuselage after Nando and Roberto had gone over the other side of that ridge must have been the worst of all. I cannot even imagine. Well, this is one that certainly makes you think about just how far we can go to survive, just how far an iron will can take us beyond the limits of what we thought possible. I know this has been a long and gruesome one, but I appreciate you sticking it out with me. Please let me know what you think you would be willing to do. Let me know if you think there was anything wrong with the decisions that were made. When you take a step back and think about it, I think they chose right. I never thought I would say that about the situation, but I think that it may still haunt them of what they had to do and the choice they had to make. But I think these people truly did the best they could and still do to this day. Please let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comment section down below. Please do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you are still here watching, please place a plain emoji in the comments so I know who my real MVPs are. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.